I'm Todd Jones, recovering from 30 years as a sports writer. Thanks for joining me as I sit down with some of the best sports writers of our time, who knew the greatest athletes and coaches and experienced firsthand some of the biggest sports moments of the past half century. We'll share stories behind the stories, some we've only told each other. Pull up a seat on Press Box Access. People talk about the media as if it doesn't consist of people. You know, real humans. But the best reporters and writers, especially in sports, open themselves up to see the humanity in what they're covering. That's what made Liz Clarke so special. She brought empathy, curiosity, and thoughtfulness to everything and everyone she wrote about. Her big heart lit up her stellar work. Liz was all in, all the time. That comes through in this conversation with her, and it makes this one of my favorite interviews on this show. Hey, Liz, thanks for joining us on Press Box Access. This is a real treat.
Well, you're nice to have me, Todd. It's good to see you, and always love talking about our wonderful profession.
Yeah, we've got a lot of ground to cover.
Yeah.
So first off, congratulations on retiring in April. You got out.
Yes. I mean, I guess I'm one of the few who kind of sets the terms of their departure, which is a great privilege. And I'm 62 and a half. And about 2 years ago, I started posing the question to myself, could I retire at 62? What would that look like? Mm-hmm. I guess the key thing to say here is that I absolutely loved every day and every experience of my 37 years as a reporter, the last 33 of that as a sports writer. Even the horrible, tough days, I love them all. It was just a lifetime of experiences and friendships and challenges I never dreamt possible. But I'm also an insulin-dependent diabetic, which is each of us has their own challenges. For me, that's been a bit of a health challenge that gets kind of more difficult the longer you have it. And there's a kind of cumulative toll of the travel and the stress and as much anything, the way I do my job, which is perpetual anxiety. I kind of make it, way more fraught than it ought to be. I just, as I neared 60, I was really facing a health versus, can I do this job at a lesser intensity? And I just wasn't interested in that, but very interested in a very dynamic, fun, engaged, totally separate from sports, third act of life.
That perpetual anxiety, though, that you mentioned, that perpetual anxiety, that is really one of the many things that made you such a great reporter and writer is that you were always on top of things, whether it be tennis or NASCAR or international events such as the World Cup or Olympics, the NFL team. You had to carry that through. So that's what the rhythm of the life was like, right? As a reporter.
Well, first of all, thank you for your generosity in that. I mean, there's a couple ways to look at that. I did fret and worry and prepare to an absurd amount, but that's because, very few things I covered, if any, were like steeped in my bones since childhood. I was kind of an accidental sports writer. I mean, a very proud one, but it wasn't like many of our peers, a dream since I was 8 years old and I threw, baseballs with my dad in the yard and dreamed of being in a press box. I didn't have that type of narrative, which many people do. So I approached every assignment, whether it was, an NFL team, a World Cup soccer match, the most random Olympic sport, luge, skeleton, curling, things that are totally cool and you need to prepare and know about, but it wasn't steeped in my bones.
I have this specific memory of the U.S. Olympic track and field trials in Sacramento. I had a local throwing the hammer and I was writing deadline versions of hammer throw. And I'm thinking to myself, how did I end up here?
Exactly.
He picked it up, he threw it. What am I supposed to say on 3 different editions of this?
Yes. No. I remember being sent, like spur of the moment, to cover skeleton at the, I think it was the Salt Lake City Olympics in 2002. And happily, there was a bus ride of some sort to get to that venue for the skeleton. And, back in the day, I mean, I know I had a cell phone, but it wasn't like there was the reliable enough connection to do research that way. So right when I was told go cover skeleton, I printed out everything possible about what is skeleton, what is a skeleton, how does it work, what are the rules, kind of skeleton for dummies. So I had this stack of paper, and on the bus, I'm frantically highlighting, oh, it's shaped like this, it weighs this much, and this is, it's actually a head first sport. It's not a feet. That's how elemental a lot of my education was. But I just didn't want to embarrass the paper. I didn't want to embarrass myself. And I wanted to do, above all, justice to the athletes, to respect their sport, to know enough about their sport, to respect all the years of training and sacrifice that they had put in. I wanted to put in that, albeit in a frantically compressed amount of time.
I think we're kindred spirits. I used to carry around files, like J. Edgar Hoover type files of clippings and marked up things and notes and cheat sheets. And I always felt it was like my security blanket because I really didn't know what I was doing. I was a fraud.
Yes. Yeah, but there's no crime in over preparing, because then, you write with confidence, or at least I write with confidence. It's hard for me to write well if I'm fretting, am I going to expose myself as not really being in command of this? And if I feel in command, I write better.
Right. You mentioned it was an accidental career. I love that term. You started out as a higher education reporter at the Raleigh News and Observer, but then you switched to sports by moving to the Charlotte Observer. Why did you decide to become a sports writer?
Yes, it was. It actually was a career fork that I had not planned. I didn't see coming. And I'm just so very grateful for it. So as I started out as a generic news reporter, cops, courts, school boards, the whole thing. And then I had come to specialize in higher education, which was a great beat at the Raleigh News and Observer, because the UNC system is so significant to that state's, economic present and future. And so I love that beat. I absolutely love that beat. I ended up, through covering higher education, writing about academic fraud in college sports. Specifically.
No, really? There's fraud in academics?
Shock. The coverage was largely about the men's basketball team at NC State under Jim Valvano, who was just a totally beloved, charismatic figure, having won the national championship and very dynamic. But it was an era and an administration when, a lot of rules were bent, if not flouted, to keep members of the team academically eligible under the requirements.
Right.
So back in the day, it was an era in the 80s in which sports sections generally focused on event coverage, game advance, game story, game follow, all the things strictly on the field, and less emphasis on off the field issues. So through the higher ed beat, I wrote about the implications of this for the faculty. It actually, there was sort of a faculty uprising because they felt the academic rule bending was preventing the university from being regarded nationally as it should, as it deserved to.
Right.
So that kind of made it my turf. So I ended up with another reporter, a news side reporter named John Day, who's now a lawyer. We wrote for about a year and a half on that basketball team and the issue of how you keep a player eligible when the GPA doesn't justify that. And anyway, that led to kind of a job inquiry or a job offer from our main competing paper, the Charlotte Observer. And once I met the sports editor, this awesome editor named Gary Schwab,
yeah.
I was like, I have to do this. This is not really my plan, but how cool. So what I thought was like a 3 to 5 year detour in the world of sports became the rest of my working life. I never left sports because I came to really love the opportunity, the challenge, the narratives, and I did my best to grow with it, you know, and cover things I felt capable of covering, and if not, you know, really well versed in.
Liz, do you think your lack of pardon the expression, but the lack of knowledge about sports at the start really kind of made you more open to asking questions and going down alleys that maybe you wouldn't have if you had grown up as a sports fan?
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, no doubt. But I mean, then again, I really believe in self-determination and you make your own fate. So you have to do what's required to succeed and own your failures and your successes. So I will tell you the way it worked for me is, you know, none of us who covers a city council or local government, the basic entry-level reportings, we don't know the fine points of zoning laws or how a school board operates, or, you know, few among us have run for office who are covering political office. So I think any reporter, no matter what your beat or what your background, there's a profound level of humility you really must bring to the assignment to realize you're not the expert. You know, you may be able to write a fine sentence, but that doesn't mean you really can understand the many layers of what's going on. You know, I think one thing I lacked that in many ways was a good thing is not just automatic awe of athletes. I mean, I'm really good dealing with alphas, you know, whether they're politicians or editors or NASCAR drivers. I mean, I don't bow to people. I'm not obsequious. I mean, I'm always respectful, you know, unless you give me a reason. If we're going to go at it, fine.
Right. But you're not going to take the crap.
No, I'm not going to take the crap, but I'm also not going to just assume that because you're great at your sport, you're a great person, or because you say this, you really mean it. You know, what you don't want in sports writers is fawning and awe.
Idolatry, right.
Yeah, idolatry. Thank you. That's the best word. Again, respect, you know, is a different category.
Liz, was there a moment early in your career where that helped you, that you recall an anecdote with a particular athlete or a coach or somebody that was set up as one thing and then you saw right through it?
You know, it actually, now that I think about it, or that you plant the seed, I think that is really why I ended up getting along so well with Dale Earnhardt, the guy, you know, the dad, the late Dale Earnhardt. I guess what worked in my favor, that is the opposite of awe. You know, he was the ultimate badass and just, you know, drove the black car, the black 3. He was mirrored sunglasses, you know, impenetrable,
the intimidator
kind of persona, intimidator. Yeah. Exactly. Right. And he was known among reporters as a giant pain in the ass, you know, very surly and moody. And, you know, people kind of tippy-toed around him. And he, all that's true, but that was not truly who he was. I came to learn. So one of my first assignments was do a long profile of Dale Earnhardt. And this was preceded by negotiating, like, how much time can I get around Dale Earnhardt? And so stunningly, again, really not because of me, the place of the Charlotte Observer, I was allowed to shadow him for a whole day. It actually ended up being almost a whole weekend because there were other events. But my main meeting, when I got to know him, was this day that I spent with him, although I had dealt with him a little bit at the track and seen how he treated other people, and people kind of gave him a wide berth, in other words. So I was supposed to meet him at his race shop, not the one that he raced for, but his personal one where his kids had their race cars. And Dale Jr. being one of them, he was quite young at the time, at 7:30 one morning. And we were going to go to North Wilkesboro, a track that is now defunct, but was just recently brought back online through Dale Jr. That's another sidetrack. Anyway, I had to meet him at his race shop. It was 7:30. He immediately offered me a Sundrop soda and a chicken biscuit, for breakfast, because we were going to have this long day.
Nice.
And how great is that? And we ended up like jumping in his pickup truck and heading out for the drive up to North Wilkesboro, which is like 90 minutes. Most people, maybe a bit less for him.
So it's you and Earnhardt in the cabin of his truck.
Well, there was his PR guy was in the back, and there was a back seat.
So how did he drive on a regular road? Oh,
just, I mean, not ridiculous, but not like a normal person. I mean, he took back roads. So like no paying attention to the solid lines or no passing zones, just zip, zip, zip. But there weren't a lot of cars on the road at that hour. And then coming home that early evening, there were cars. We went a different way. And he was just a hellacious tailgater, just a pain in the ass tailgater, which I cannot stand. Just a bully, but I never felt unsafe. I'll tell you that. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is, so I spent this whole day, and he understood I was there. It was Liz from the Charlotte Observer was going to shadow him. Mm-hmm. And so, I just had my notepad, and I didn't ask him a ton of questions. I was like writing in my notebook, like what he said, all this, that, and the other. And then I realized it was really getting on his nerves. And at one point he's like, "Aren't you going to ask me anything?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah." I said, "But right now I'm just learning by watching you. I figured I'd learn more by just listening and watching." And he's like, I think he liked that. And I'm sorry, this is a muddled memory, but there were moments where he'd like provoke, kind of ask kind of challenging questions, and just, I could tell he was testing me, is what he was doing. He was just trying to see what, did I have a spine, or, who was I? I wasn't his normal reporter. Mm-hmm. I didn't seem to shrink from him, but could he kind of back me down? And I wasn't really doing anything confrontational. And I just would sass him back. I mean, he'd sass me, I'd sass him back.
And he liked that.
He liked that. It was totally like that. And some memories are personal that I won't share, but just over the years, he was super helpful and super kind. And I know that's because I didn't treat him like the intimidator. I asked him normal things. I asked him about his dad. I asked him about things that weren't strictly about turning left, or being a badass. That didn't play into the stereotype. Because the truth is, he was an incredibly loyal, caring, sensitive person and a deep thinker. I mean, he dropped out of school in the 9th grade, something he regretted for the rest of his life. And we talked about that a good bit. But super smart. I mean, one of the smartest people I've ever come to know, along with Junior Johnson, who also didn't finish traditional schooling. But, if he trusted you, he trusted you. And it was good to get to that point. And I think if I had just treated him like this two-dimensional cardboard figure that he made millions off of, I'm the intimidator, I'm the badass.
Right.
It wouldn't have got beyond a two-dimensional understanding of him. You treated him
like a person, not a persona.
Yeah. And that's kind of how I expected to be treated too, like a professional. But I guess I'm not saying anything unique.
Actually, you are. I mean, because most people only know Earnhardt as the persona, as the intimidator.
Well, that's all he wanted them. 3. That's all he wanted people to know about him. That's certainly all he wanted his rivals to know about him. And that was the mirrored sunglasses, the pain in the ass. This is how I drive. He'd sit in his car about like this, and
hunched way down.
Oh, actually, that irritated him so when we spent the day at North Wilkesboro, to get from one part of the track to the other, I think we took a golf cart. I know we took a golf cart. And so he drove and we got in it. And so I went like that. And I'm like, he's like, why are you sitting that way? And I'm like, you sit that way. And I wanted to see what's the big whoop? Like, why are you doing that?
Right.
And he's like, you sit up proud. You're riding with me, So, I just treated him like a normal person.
I'm fascinated, Liz, about your working relationship with Earnhardt, because again, you were able to get past that surface image. And that's not easy to do with people at a certain level of success. And how did that carry through your career of covering NASCAR? Because you covered NASCAR for many, many years. Charlotte Observer, USA Today, Dallas Morning News, Washington Post, obviously. And you wrote the 2008 book, One Hell of a Ride, How NASCAR Swept the Nation, about its growth. So you had to get the type of access that wasn't easy to get. How did that help you with Earnhardt through the years?
Well, I mean, for sure, because I worked at the Charlotte Observer, that was everything, for access. And again, this was pre-internet, pre the explosion of different outlets. Drivers didn't have blogs or websites, all athletes. The way you reached fans was through the print media and a little bit, ESPN. That was getting to be a big deal. But, the place of the print media was far bigger then to athletes than it is now. Right. The place of the Charlotte Observer in stock car racing, there was nothing more important. So I arrived with the benefit of, I'm Liz from the Charlotte Observer, and I'm here and I work with Tom Higgins, who was the dean of motorsports racers for the Charlotte Observer. So, and in fact, for the longest time, Earnhardt, he knew my name, but he would call me Little Higgins. So Tom Higgins was the dean of racers. It would be like, oh, here she comes, Little Higgins, So those were in my favor before, I earned any of it. Those were gifts that I tried to, appreciate and use.
You had to use that to then gain trust.
Yeah, I have always been transparent about my intentions. I'm working on the story. To do it well, I need A, B, and C. Would you think about it? Would you, and you can talk to Tom Higgins. I never burn people. I've covered a million different sports. 37 years. I do not burn people. That doesn't mean I write, candy, powder puff stories. Mm-hmm. I write hard stories. I write some very difficult stories, but no one is shocked by what I write. Nobody feels backstabbed by what I write. They know what I'm going to write. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like it helped that if somebody asked about me, can I trust her? What's she like? It would either be, I don't know her, or yeah, you can trust her. Right. She'll tell you what's up. Whatever. So that helped. And then again, I wasn't awed by him. I do think oddly, Earnhardt felt like an outsider. He was an outsider, super conscious again of not finishing high school, super devastated by the death of his father at a very young age. He had such a hard life, married, got a girlfriend pregnant, married as a teenager, worked in a gas station, worked in a cotton mill, right. It just earned everything the hard way and hustled and did not grow up with a lot of kind of refined social graces. And then he was a multimillionaire and a corporate spokesperson. Mm-hmm. So he was a kind of acutely aware of ways in which he was in the mainstream. And I honestly think he identified with me as like, well, she doesn't fit in either. Mm-hmm. Here's an outsider. She's making her way. She's earning her way. I knew him over several years and observed him in different settings. And 3 or 4 different papers. I would always find a way to write about him or reason to spend time with him. And, he was incredibly caring to elderly people, incredibly gracious to older people,
really?
To anyone with a disability, to little kids. But like the toughest demographic for him was, the classic NASCAR fan, that guys that would show up wearing his picture on their chest.
Right.
I think it was hard for him to understand. I don't know. I have a thought, but I'm not making sense of it. But he had a real goodness to him, but an affinity, I think, for people on the margins more so than in the mainstream.
That's interesting.
And I think it helped me that I was, in his view, on the margins, but it was not holding me back. I got my interviews. I busted my ass in the garage. I asked questions. I did not, also in the NFL, I did not pretend to have knowledge I didn't.
Right.
I'm like, explain me a restrictor plate and show it to me. How does it work? I didn't say, to Daryl Green, I played cornerback, in 8th grade, and I totally get the play you just ran.
Yeah.
Or, which a lot of guys kind of feel compelled to bring their expertise as a free safety or whatever.
That's like a fraudulent way of trying to relate to somebody.
Yeah. And I think athletes see through that.
Right. Earnhardt didn't, he saw you for what you were. I think that's really interesting that you were able to develop this rapport and this relationship because he saw you as a bit on the margins, a woman coming into the world of sports writing and NASCAR and working your ass off. And really doing the type of work that he respected. And again, I think the thing that stresses, it's not friendship. It's totally different.
It's totally different. But he was very funny. It was early on in our relationship. I cannot remember for what reason, but we were in his hauler and the transporter truck and talking. And I mentioned to him that I was diabetic, that I had diabetes. And he honestly went like almost white as a sheet. He's like, you have the sugar? Which I don't know, you're not a Southerner, but that's a old time euphemism for having diabetes. If you have the sugar, you have the sugar. And it was in the old school South, it was a stigma. It's like you had cancer, and it was a fatal illness. And it was bad. And he's like, you have the sugar? And I'm like, yeah. And my parents are Southerners. I'm like, yeah. And he's like, you have to give yourself shots? And I'm like, yeah, like 7 times a day. He's like, I could never do that. I could never give myself shots. And I'm like, I could never race a race car at 200 miles an hour. I said, that's good. So
he didn't want anything to do with putting a needle in his arm. But
that was a level of bravery that blew his mind. And then he's like, then he became like totally Dale. He's like, you don't need to be hanging out with those other reporters drinking. And I'm like, well, Dale, I don't do that. He's like, well, if you have the sugar, you can't be out drinking like those other reporters. I'm like, fear not.
He was like looking out for you.
Yeah. Very dear.
What was it like for you, and this is a difficult question, but on February 18th, 2001, you're covering the Daytona 500. What was it like for you personally and as a reporter to be there that tragic day when Dale died on the final lap of that race?
Yeah. So I have, apart from the death of my parents, that was the worst day of my life, by a mile. And, I've tried to talk about this to journalism classes, and it's hard. So forgive me. It's just hard every time because it feels like it was yesterday. And I had covered enough death in racing and enough horrible accidents that were not fatal to know. And I had taken actually a special course in racetrack safety to get better at my job at one point. So I knew that the shorter duration of the crash the more dangerous it is for the driver. It's the crashes that look worse. If the car barrel rolls 12 times, that's safest for the driver because all that energy dissipates over time. If it's over like that, the entire energy is transmitted through the body.
Yeah.
And
so you knew right away that it was bad.
I knew it was incredibly serious. And then there's a protocol that follows. So anytime a driver's in a crash, you're supposed to lower your window net. So the driver's side window, there's no glass. There's just this webbing.
Right.
And no, you lower it to signal I'm conscious, to the people speeding to help you, like I'm conscious.
Right.
So it's like the first thumbs up. That's how you give the thumbs up. So the car stopped and the window net is not coming down.
Yeah.
And the car drifts down the banking. I mean, I was just shaken. And then the race ends, like seconds go by. I mean, the race ends like 2 seconds later. So the focus of the broadcast, the focus of everybody in the press box is on who wins. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't take my eye off his car. And then Daryl Waltrip said something like, I just hope Earnhardt is okay.
Right.
And, the first driver to the car was Ken Schrader, who I mentioned earlier. And the happiest, funniest, everybody loves Schrader. Schrader loves everybody. And he was first to the window. And when the ESPN got him immediately, or whoever was broadcasting got him, and I'd never seen such a look on his face. And he just said, all he said was, we just have to pray. Mm. And I started crying right then. And so I called the paper, and there was someone running the paper who, it was her first weekend running the paper. It was a Sunday, and she was quite young. And Courtney, and it was before the internet. It's hard to explain how information flowed far differently then. And I just said, there's been a terrible crash. I'm worried about Earnhardt. It's possible he's been taken to the hospital. I said, if he dies, it is possible that you'll know before we know, because races don't like to announce a death. That, right. In that I could picture the AP being in the hospital and getting confirmation of the death before NASCAR confirmed that he was dead. Right. And I just said, please know, if he's dead, this is an A1 story, and you've got to call me immediately. Because the Washington Post at that time, they didn't really understand how important he was. Mm-hmm. And so I just started writing a basic news story. So-and-so won a crash-marred Daytona 500, a race in which 7-time champion Dale Earnhardt crashed and was taken to the hospital with XXX. I was going to say serious injuries, fill in later, just to get going. And everybody's typing along. And then my cell phone rang, and it was Courtney. And she just said, I'm sorry. And then I didn't hear anything. So it did happen like I thought. The AP moved on the wire. Dale Earnhardt is dead. And it might have been 15 minutes before it was announced in the press box. It might have been 5. I can't remember. But the president of NASCAR came in and confirmed it later. But I had known, and I didn't make a sound because I didn't want to tell anyone. I couldn't speak. I just started crying and had to type. And then she called back and said, they want you to write an A1 story, an appreciation of him, and then something else. I had to do 2 stories. And it was unfathomable, but it was unfathomable because it was him. It was his track. He was just the best. And plus he he was invincible. He was the intimidator, the badass, like nothing bad could ever happen to Dale. And I've covered some bad things that happened to Dale. I remember him racing with a broken sternum at Indy once. And then I'll stop here. But I mean, what followed was days of mourning and investigation, and the seatbelt was broken, and what some serious news, safety questions. The funeral followed. It was a long time before I left.
A whole other range of
the
stories.
outpouring of grief.
Liz, can I ask you something real fast?
Sorry, yes, I'll stop.
Liz, how did you write that night? How were you able to write being as upset as you were? Oh,
I mean, I just thought of it. I think somebody had put this advice in my head years earlier. I don't know why, how, or what the occasion was, but I just thought, take the emotion out, or not take it out, just set it aside. And I thought of the story like building blocks, like child's building blocks. And I'm just like, make one paragraph, make a second paragraph. Each paragraph was a building block, and so I wrote the news story first, which is like follows a sequence. And then here's who Dale was. I'm writing for a general audience and then my phone kind of starts blowing up, like my dad called, who would never call an assignment, but, and a boyfriend at the time called because they knew how much I love Dale. And I'm just, can't talk. And I stopped answering. I just thought of it as clearly in a logical order as possible, get through the news story. And I did that. And then I had to write the appreciation, which was kind of a more personal thing. And it happened that really like 9 months prior, I had spent time with Earnhardt at his farm, and we got in his truck again, he was the best place to interview him when he was driving. And, but we were just like putting around his farm. He wanted to show me the pond where he fished, and he had a chicken farm, like the chicken coops, like we were, anyway.
Right. He was proud to show you all this.
Totally proud and totally relaxed when he was driving. And it was his turf. I mean, literally his turf. And I would just run the tape recorder and we'd talk. And we talked about his retirement. And so he was 49 then. And he was saying, he was worrying about it already. He's like, am I going to know when it's time to retire? He's like, I don't want to hang on till I'm pathetic. I don't want to hang on too long. He's like, I've watched Michael Jordan, how he retired, and anyway, he was speaking so thoughtfully about knowing that his end was coming, at least in this iteration. And he was starting to become a car owner. And I had the whole transcript of that day in my laptop. And so when I was thinking, okay, how do I make this appreciation? I'm like, go read your transcript. I mean, I'm talking like take 5 minutes and read this transcript. And it was so poetic the way he was speaking about it. And then things that I knew about him just came to me. And that was more cathartic in a way. And I'm the queen of missing deadlines, but I didn't miss either deadline. I mean, these were the most important stories.
Yeah. And like you said early in our conversation, like you owed it to the athlete and the audience to do a good job, right? Even in that very emotional moment, you had a job to do.
Yeah.
The next day, I think you took a walk across the grounds of Daytona Speedway, right?
With Chuck Culpepper. Yeah, then I spent the next day because NASCAR was going to have a press conference, I believe. I hope my sequence is right. I mean, I didn't leave. Explaining, was the seatbelt broken? Was it cut? Was it frayed?
Right.
This, that, and the other. I remember asking who was the manufacturer of the seatbelt. There were only like 2 possibilities. And then being treated like a effing pariah to ask an obvious news question. But anyway, it was an obvious question, a small matter. But, I started out walking to because I just cannot describe the outpouring of grief that had to be captured. And I felt myself, and as a reporter, that was my job. So, there was a memorial already, flowers, teddy bears, tributes, signs, outside turn 4, where the crash had been, outside the track. I think now there's a statue of Dale, I believe, there. And I came across the wonderful Chuck Culpepper, who's now
our mutual friend, the great Chuck Culpepper.
You knew him a bit. And we just were like travelers in this day of tears. And I remember Mike Vega being there too from the Boston Globe.
Right.
And, nobody had words. Nobody had words. And, it was a long series of days of press conferences and questions, and then a funeral service in Charlotte. And then the next weekend's race was at Rockingham, North Carolina. And that was a hard thing to cover. It was a hard thing for everybody. I don't mean to make it sound like I had the hard time. I mean, my God, his son raced the next weekend, and everybody in the garage, everybody was just, there was the level of disbelief. It just took forever for it to sink in. He was gone. I don't think NASCAR's ever recovered. It's never been the same.
I appreciate you sharing the emotion of that, because I do feel like we think of people like Earnhardt they are icons, and then we think of them almost as not human. And then I think there's a tendency to think that the media is not human, that these aren't people, these are just the media. But when you develop working relationships over years, you're a person, you get an understanding of someone, and then they have to do your work in that moment. It shows the humanity that's on the other side of the wall. That's the reporters.
But it's so much. I mean, I've covered a lot of death, a lot of death in my time, and shed a lot of tears. That was hardly the first set of stories I wrote through tears. I mean, writing about what happened to Simone Biles and the Olympic gymnasts, at Larry Nassar's, how these athletes were betrayed and exploited. And, if you've ever covered a thoroughbred race and seen a horse break down, and it's just, there's a lot of tragedy in sport.
That's the spectrum of emotion. I think that, as a writer, you were dealing with all ends. You're dealing with the most difficult things. And then there are times in your career when you think about it, you're just overwhelmed with joy about witnessing something.
On such a...
you don't have to apologize, because I think it's really revealing about how writers do their job, especially before the internet took over, how we had the time and the access to develop a working rapport and an understanding. And I think, the flip side of it is there are moments when you're standing there watching somebody set a world record or do something heroic, and you're like, I can't believe that we're witnessing this, and now I have the obligation to try to write about what it's like to be here.
I mean, the list of moments that I pinched myself, like, I cannot believe, like, I am witnessing this moment in history. And
give us a favorite.
No, there's so many.
All right, come on, Liz.
No, I mean, my very first Olympics was the 2000 Olympics in Sydney. And my first event I covered was the triathlon, which started at the Sydney Opera House. And I believe I had like my first cell phone, and I broke every Washington Post rule so that I could call my mother, right before it started. And as a kid, I loved it.
That was my first Olympics. I remember those phones. Those phones were like James Bond. They were like James Bond phones. These little tiny things. I couldn't believe it. They were so clear sounding.
Yes. And, the first time I walked through the gates at Wimbledon, I just couldn't believe, like, I am here at Wimbledon. The first Olympics I got to cover gymnastics. It wasn't my first Olympics. Someone else was covering it. But when it the beat came to me, that was my favorite sport. When they started marching in that arena, I cried. I cried because as a kid, the Washington Post was my favorite newspaper, my revered newspaper, and gymnastics was my favorite sport. And I'm like, this paper has not only hired me, they've sent me to Athens, Greece, and I have the job of describing this for Washington Post readers, this most beautiful thing. I just couldn't believe it. Weren't
you at the 2010 World Cup in South Africa?
I was just then thinking about Nelson Mandela. The 6 weeks in South Africa, I'd never been in Africa. It was my second World Cup, which I covered with Steve Goff, like the awesome, most incredibly kind coworker and brilliant soccer writer. But that 2010 World Cup, the time in South Africa, I learned so much. Obviously I had studied apartheid in college. Anyone who lived and read newspapers.
You were a history major, right?
Yeah, but I hope we all knew the horrors of apartheid and the fight to dismantle it. And, for South Africa to host the World Cup, it was just 20 years after Nelson Mandela had been freed from prison. And, I was so overwhelmed in so many settings. The first thing I did in breaking away from the scripted, U.S. press corps where you're ferried to practice back and forth, which is a great thing,
right.
But as a reporter, you need to break away and report your own stories. I got a driver to take me into Soweto because I wanted to see the township, and I went to Nelson Mandela's home where he lived. I just could not believe the warmth and welcome of the South African people, what this event meant in terms of reconciliation. I thought so much about how can this country, just 20 years removed from the horrors of their apartheid system, it seemingly be so much farther down the road to racial reconciliation than our own country, after 200 years. And, it's not, it was just a lot to reflect on. And the sound of the vuvuzela is just a great sound. There's so much culturally that was different and singular.
Yeah,
about
that horn sound is so unique.
Horn, like, and I was thinking actually, I've taken pictures of these 33 years in sports, but I so wish I had made an audio diary, like audio, because I was thinking earlier, like the great sounds of my career, that there's nothing like it. Like the pinch me moments,
right.
The pinch me moments.
Right.
If you're standing inside turn one of the Daytona 500 on lap one, like 43 race cars going to turn one, it's there's nothing like that sound. The sound in the same spot at the Indy 500 of an IndyCar race, but in the old IndyCar days, completely different sound, but that too was unique. The sound of the vuvuzela was unique. The sound of, the way the tennis ball hits on clay at the French Open. It's like this sort of thud and the sound of the players skidding. It's just these moments that you wish, to my credit, even as I lived it, I knew, like, please remember this moment. You're so lucky. You're so lucky. And there are so many of those lucky moments. Yeah. Lucky is such an inadequate word. But, not to mention the learning you try to do in the middle of your job. To the Post, in my 25 years, they sent me to cover sporting events on 6 continents. 6 out of 7. And, it's not to say I've mastered the world, but, I was able to scoot away and see the Parthenon and see
right.
the Great Wall of China and the Eiffel Tower and Christ the Redeemer, the statue in Rio. I mean, I what a privilege! What an incredible privilege.
I think I have a much greater appreciation now that I'm out of the business and older. But I always felt an obligation when I was in places like that to take the reader with me. That I'm here, you're not. Here's what it's like to be here.
Yes. And to tour Robben Island in Cape Town, which is where Mandela was imprisoned. I mean, one of the most profound tours I've ever taken of that island.
When you were in the press box at that World Cup and Mandela comes in to the stadium, what was that moment like?
That was I take that to my grave, to have been able to be in that press box with Steve Goff at that final. And I don't believe we knew that Mandela was going to be there, but he was quite elderly. He died not long after that. He was in a golf cart, and ridden around. And it was just the most ear-splitting. If ear-splitting and reverence can be in the same sound, it's what that was. It wasn't ear-splitting like mania of like wild. It was just complete awe and appreciation. And how many people can say they saw Nelson Mandela, and have the chance to learn a little bit more deeply about what he meant to a nation and what, the meaning of forgiveness is and reconciliation is. And it's not to say that that country has solved its legacy, its problems. But I guess what I'm saying is to be in the presence of greatness, and here the world is gathering, right? Here the world has gathered literally by TVs to honor the greatest soccer players in the world, the greatest event.
Right.
But the real champion is this miniature ancient man. That's the champion we're honoring. It's Nelson Mandela, and champions take many forms, but there's no sporting champion like him. I would say these, for me, it was almost always the international events that I love so much because they're so, I don't know, scary, but they just strip you down to the most humble level. Like, I need to master this transit system, do the best I can with this language, get what I need, figure out the time difference, figure out when I can sleep, what I can eat, like so many challenges that before you even type the first word, I love that crushing challenge. So there was something about the glorious rush of Olympics every 2 years, once in a while, World Cups, maybe two slams a year.
Tennis, right?
That was sustaining. It's like, oh my God, this year maybe I'll get to cover that. And, whatever's required to get to that point I'm going to do. But then the real connective tissue, what's truly sustaining are the friends. And that's not simply your coworkers like the fabulous Sally Jenkins, or Barry Svrluga or Stephen Goff, the people you sweat through the assignments, Mike Jones, as you and I know, sometimes your tribe, your family, it's people others would say are your competitors, reporters from other papers, maybe reporters from other countries. You get to know each other on the road. I mean, for the South Africa World Cup, for several Wimbledons, I was a roommate with Michelle Kaufman of the Miami Herald. It's like the dearest friend, the most wonderful person to share highs and lows with you could ever ask for. And, Bonnie Ford, getting to know her on the road, getting to know you just a wee bit, getting to know Chuck Culpepper on the road before we were coworkers. And, I have friends, reporters in Japan, in Belgium, that I'm thinking of who like help me with translations or help explain to me what does Yuzuru Hanyu, why are people so crazy about him in Japan? And what is this concept that's like childlike, but adoration and respect? And it's a whole thing that I need decoded for me. Just the most open-hearted reporters who would help you. And then you try to figure out, can I help them? Like, what can I do that's helpful to them?
Yeah, it was very relatable in the tribe to show up at a major event or even just a big game and try to figure out what are the challenges and how am I going to deal with this. But the best feeling was that you were among other reporters, other writers who were also facing all that, also facing their own insecurities. And you were able to somehow then ultimately take the reader with you because that was your job. Yeah.
And it's exactly. And especially so, before the internet, before 24/7 and blogging and tweeting and this, that, and the other, when it really mattered, the quality of your work and the way you could present it to people. Because the
words mattered.
Yeah. The balance mattered, the fairness mattered.
Right. Well, I always admired your work, A, because it was so stellar, but B, because it was so obvious the passion you brought to, whether it was the depth of the offensive line or a profile of Earnhardt or, being in South Africa for the World Cup and obviously all the great tennis you wrote. You were always there. You're always present in the moment. And I always felt like that was the way I strive to be, was to like, there's an obligation there to do your job because you have this privileged opportunity to be somewhere where you never thought you were going to be.
That's so well put. And I certainly regarded you in that same vein.
And you know what? We didn't even talk about Dan Snyder.
That's just fun. Many words have been written and said.
Oh, well, Liz, I really appreciate you taking the time to look back at highlights of your career, especially your insight about Earnhardt. And Liz, thank you so much. And I wish you all the best in retirement.
You as well. Well, you're not retired, but thank you, Todd. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Press Box Access. You can find us here with a new episode every other Wednesday. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe and follow us on Apple Podcasts or on your favorite podcast app. We'd love for you to review us. 5 stars would be nice. Follow us on social media. Drop us an email at pressboxaccess@gmail.com. And be sure to spread the word. Everyone is welcome here. This has been a production of Evergreen Podcast. A special thank you to executive producers Michael D'Aloia and Gerardo Orlando, producer Bill Hoffman, and our audio engineer Nathan Corson. I'm your host, Todd Jones. It's closing time. Rock on.
I'm Ken Harbaugh, host of Warriors in Their Own Words, a podcast that presents the unvarnished, unsanitized truth of what we have asked of those who defend this nation. As a country, we need these stories more than ever. Stories from Americans who have borne the battle, including 30-year-old remastered interviews with veterans from World War I recounting their time in the trenches of Europe, and with veterans from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and from our most recent conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other battlefields Americans may never have heard of. Hear their stories by listening to Warriors in Their Own Words wherever you find podcasts.